Hello everyone and welcome to Standard Weekly, where we look at all things Standard Magic. I'm your host Scott, and today we're going to look at Dominaria United previews from over the weekend. And a special thanks to our sponsor, Caffeinated Gamers. Please like and subscribe the video for us so we can share our content with others. Alright, with that said, let's get started. Our first release from this weekend that we want to look at is Karn Living Legend. So the story of Dominaria United has been kind of centered around Karn and his search for the Phyrexians on Dominaria and the battle that he is prepared to fight against them, and in the hopes of using the Silex to once and for all end the Phyrexian threat. So for 4 mana, you get a legendary planeswalker who, for +1, creates a tap Power Stone token. It's an artifact with tap to add a colorless mana. This mana cannot be spent to cast a non-artifact spell. So Karn's going to be able to, for his plus ability, create basically mana rocks for you. And one of the interesting things that we've gotten over the last several sets is from Kamigawa, there was a series of artifact creatures that synergize actually pretty well with Karn's ability here. So you'll be able to, if we can get a deck together around Karn's +1 ability here, it looks to me like using the artifact creatures from Kamigawa might be the place to go for that. Right now I'm not sure where he fits in, but I'm sure that people are going to try to make Karn work in the set. His -1 ability is pay any amount of mana, look at that many cards from the top of your library, then put one of those cards into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So for a minus ability, Karn has card draw for you. You just have to decide how many cards you want to look at to get to that one card. It could be 1 mana, it could be 10 mana, it just depends on what your needs are at that particular time. So Karn is going to have some card filtering ability for you in his -1 ability. For his -7, you get an emblem with tap an untapped artifact you control. This emblem deals 1 damage to any target. This is a really, really interesting ability. Getting Karn to the -7 where you can emblem probably won't be too hard to do if he can stick on the board for a few turns, especially if Karn is going to be in an artifact creature based deck. And again, as we move forward into the next several sets with the Brothers War and then on to Mirrodin and into New Phyrexia, we're going to see more and more artifact creatures and artifacts as we move forward. So I think what we'll be able to do is protect Karn fairly easily as we move through those sets. And I think Karn gets better as this standard year progresses through it. And having the ability to simply tap an artifact to do 1 damage, and that can be at the, and it doesn't say it has to be on your turn. So at the end of your opponent's turn, any untapped artifacts that you have, you can just tap, they do a damage to your opponent, you untap, you can do it again. So I can see Karn potentially within a couple of turns wiping out your opponent because of his ability, his emblem, to go ahead and tap to deal 1 damage any artifact. So that's our first card of the day. So let's look at now Defiler of Faith. We've seen that there's a Defiler series of cards in the set, and this one is for 3 colorless mana and 2 white. It's a Phyrexian human who has Vigilance. As an additional cost to cast white permanent spells, you may pay 2. Those spells cost 1 white mana less to cast if you paid life on this turn. Or this way, excuse me. This effect reduces only the amount of white mana you pay. Whenever you cast a white permanent spell, create a 1/1 white soldier token, creature token. So what Defiler does, along with the other Defiler cards in the set, is reduce the amount of colored mana that you have to pay. So instead of casting a card on turn 5, if it's a 5 mana card, you could cast it on turn 4 for 1 less mana and paying 2 life. So let's look at the other cards again for a second. So we talked about Defiler of Vigor, and we briefly looked at Defiler of Dreams. So again, these are all very synergetic cards that are reducing the cost of dealing a spell in a particular color, buy 1 mana of that color for paying 2 life. So I can see this really working well in a life gain deck, where you're gaining life regularly, and you can afford to pay some extra life to get creatures out a little bit faster than you would otherwise. In addition to that, their special abilities, I think, play well for each of them. Defiler Dreams, you get to draw a card when you cast a blue spell. Defiler Vigor, you get a +1 counter for each creature. On each creature you control when you cast a green spell, and Defiler of Faith creates a 1/1 soldier. So we haven't seen the black and the red ones yet, but I'm going to assume they're going to give us something similar in those. So I think this whole sequence has some ability to be played because it brings value with it. Not necessarily the turn it comes into play, but it can continue to bring you value, because whether it's Defiler of Faith, where you're creating a 1/1 white soldier token, whether it's Defiler of Vigor, where you're putting a +1/+1 counter on each of your creatures, or Defiler of Dreams, where you're drawing a card, each of them has a bonus ability that should push them forward and help advance your game plan. Next we have Phoenix Chick. For 1 red mana, you get a flying haste Phoenix Chick that cannot block. Whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures, you may pay 2 red. If you do, return Phoenix Chick from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped and attacking with a +1/+1 counter. One of the things that throughout Magic's history is Phoenix have always had a way to come back from the graveyard. This one's a little bit unique, that it's a 1/1 creature. Typically it's 3 or 4 mana for a Phoenix. But I really like this card. I really like the fact that it has flying. Red doesn't have many flying creatures in general. It's just Phoenixes and dragons. So a 1/1 flying creature in red, while it doesn't seem like it's a big deal, the ability to go fly over an opponent's board and continue to do damage is really important. And the fact that you get to attack with it on the turn that it enters play, whether that's you casting it from your hand or returning it from the graveyard, I think red decks are going to want to have this, and I think it's going to be a card that we're going to see a lot of, just because of that ability to come out of the graveyard, return to the battlefield, and hit your opponent for 2, making it a mini shock or play with fire for 2 mana. So it's a little bit more expensive than that, but it's I think a really good card, and I think red decks are going to want this. Next we have Plaza of Heroes. So Plaza of Heroes is a land that taps to add colorless mana, that taps to add 1 mana of any color, spend this mana only to cast a legendary spell, tap to add 1 mana of any color among legendary permanents you control, or 3, and tap to exile Plaza of Heroes, target legendary creature, gains hexproof and indestructible until end of the turn. So this is an interesting card for Standard. I think probably its place is mostly in Commander, because we're going to see more legendary creatures in Commander decks. But I think if a legendary deck does develop, and we've seen Super Friend decks where we've got 3 or 4 or 5 planeswalkers all working together, this is a really good card for that kind of setup. So if we do see Super Friends, this is a good place for it to be. Or we know there are around 40 legendary creatures coming to us in Dominaria United, plus we've had other legendary creatures from the other sets that we're going to have in Standard. So I think there's a potential for a legendary creatures deck that would want to use this. Now, unfortunately, we had Bard class in the last Standard season, or the Standard season is about to rotate from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, and that was really a Gruul-focused card with red and green. And we saw it sometimes, but not very often. So I'm not sure how much play Plaza of Heroes is going to see, but it's an interesting potential inclusion in any deck that wants to have a lot of legendary creatures. And it would be legendary creatures, planeswalkers, legendary spells, artifacts are considered to be legendary as well. So I think there's some really good synergy here, and potentially, when we talked as we started today about Karn, this might be a card that wants to go in a deck with Karn. So not 100% sure on its place, but I think it has some playability in Standard. Next, we want to look at Keldon Flame Sage. I'm looking at this card because I don't think it's going to see a lot of play in Standard, first of all. But it's one of those cards that you look at on the surface and you go, might be pretty good. The problem with it is it doesn't have haste. And most of the time, you're not going to be able to look deeper than 2 cards into your deck. Yes, the enlist ability is there, but for this to be really, really successful, you're going to have a deck that is really focused on instants and sorceries that you're going to be using constantly. Now, is it spells? Might want something like this, but again, the problem is it doesn't have flying, and it's susceptible to lightning strike and other cheap removal spells, so you might cast it on turn 3 and it never gets to attack because it gets removed right away. So let's talk about what the card does, and we'll talk about why it probably a little bit more about why it doesn't really work. So enlist, okay, you can tap another creature and add its power to Keldon Flame Sage, which would help it a little bit in this situation. So whenever Keldon Flame Sage attacks, look at the top X cards of your library where X is Keldon Flame Sage's power. You may exile an instant or sorcery card with mana value X or less from among them. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. You may cast the exile card without paying its mana cost. Now, if you have a lot of larger, 4 or 5 mana instants and sorceries in your deck, this could be a great value. But the problem is that how often are you going to hit one of those? How often is it going to be you attack into something, hoping to get a spell that you can use in combat to remove something or advance your game plan, and you blank on that attack because you're only looking at 2 cards, maybe 4 cards, and you end up with some lands and nothing happens, and Keldon Flame Sage is killed by one of the opponent's blocking creatures. So that's why I really feel like it's not very good. But on the surface, I think people will look at it who don't have a lot of experience with this and say, oh, this looks like a good card. But unfortunately, it probably won't see much play, if at all. Next, we have Protect the Negotiators and Rona's Vortex. So let's start with Protect the Negotiators. For 1 colorless mana and a blue, you get a spell that allows you to counter target spell unless its controller pays 1 for each creature you control. Okay, Protect the Negotiators can be kicked for 1 white mana. If the spell was kicked, create a 1/1 white soldier creature token. So first of all, for this to work, you have to have creatures. Typically what we see in decks that have a lot of counter spells, they're not really creature focused decks, so I'm not sure that this is going to see a lot of play. But we have seen Jawari Disruption played a lot throughout Standard season of the last 2 years as a 2 mana, pay 1, and counter the spell. So Protect the Negotiators has a chance to be okay, but I think you really have to have it in a deck where you're dedicated to creatures. You've got to have 16 to 20 creatures in your deck for this to be a good spell. And the really nice thing about this card, if you're playing a blue deck, like a mono blue tempo type style deck, I think this is pretty good in that, because it's going to be a card that your opponent really can't plan for, especially if you got 3, 4, 5 creatures out and they're trying to cast spells that are going to wipe the board or something like that. So I think there's a potential for it not being just a 2 mana spell where you have to kick it to get a creature to make the opponent pay 1 extra mana for a spell. But I think, again, it's got to be in a creature-based deck. So I'm not 100% sure where we're going to see this, but I think, again, if it's going to be seen, it's going to have to be in a creature-based deck. So let's look at Rona's Vortex. So for a blue mana, you get return target creature or planeswalker you don't control to its owner's hand. In this, if this spell was kicked, put that permanent on the bottom of its owner's library instead. So you can kick Rona's Vortex for 2 colorless and a black mana. Really, this is Unsummon, which goes back to the beginnings of Magic the Gathering. This is actually the alpha version of Unsummon. And you can see that they had a printing issue with it. It says return creature to owner's hand. Enchantments on creature card are discarded. It should say there, not carded. It should say discarded. Unsummon cannot be played during the attack or during the damage dealing phase of an attack. And they shortened that down to basically say return target creature to owner's hand. And that's our text for Unsummon, which we've seen throughout, really the entirety of Magic's history. There are many, many versions of this have been printed. Now, what makes Rona's Vortex potentially more powerful is that if you're playing it later in a game and your opponent puts out a creature that you just cannot deal with. Rona's Vortex, if it's kicked, then you not only deal with it by putting it back in their hand, but you actually put it on the bottom of their library to get rid of it. Now, is this something you're going to play 4 copies of in a deck? I don't think so. I think it might see 1-2 copies in a deck until we kind of see if that kick ability really does matter. But we have seen, this ability be used successfully over a number of different standard seasons. So Rona's Vortex has some chance of seeing play in standard. Next, we have potentially maybe the best card we saw over the entire weekend. Yavimaya Iconoclast. For 1 and a green mana, you get a 3/2 elf creature with kicker of red with trample. And when Yavamaya's Iconoclast enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, it gets a +1/+1 counter. Or yes, +1/+1 and gains haste until the end of the turn. So really the big thing there is it's gaining haste. And you get +1/+1 for that turn only, making it a 4/3 on turn 3. So I can see this, and if Gruul does end up being a deck as we move forward, this could be a very, very good card in that, or even really in any green deck, this potentially has the ability to be a good card. Because of the different kind of dual lands that we have, the triomes from Streets of New Capenna, getting green and red together on a card isn't going to be that difficult. Plus we have the slow lands from the Innistrad set. So I think there's a place to get yourself, a little bit of red mana if you need it in a mono green shell. But this is you're getting an above static creature that can easily attack in on the turn it's played. So if you need it on your curve to be on turn 2, okay, you can cast it for just the 2 mana, or on turn 3 you can give it haste, give it that +1/+1, and attack in right away. And the key thing here is it has trample. So most of the time, when we're hitting turn 3, your opponent may have some blockers out, but probably nothing that's going to be able to successfully completely block a 4/3 creature. All right, that's it for today and this weekend's previews. Stay tuned. We'll be coming back tomorrow to take a look at Monday's Dominaria United spoilers. Hope everybody enjoyed it. We'll see you next time.